When someone with an avoidant attachment style hurts you, what you usually see on the outside is distance, sudden coldness, silence where warmth once existed, and a strange change that can feel like a switch was turned off overnight. It can leave you going back through every conversation, every moment and every detail, wondering what you failed to notice. But what almost never becomes visible, what they rarely allow anyone else to see, is the shame that follows them after the damage has already happened. That shame does not simply disappear. It can stay much longer than most people realize, because it is connected to the way they see themselves deep down. The person walking away may look completely calm. They may appear unaffected, detached, or even relieved. But behind that controlled exterior, something much more complicated can be happening than anyone around them would ever guess. Here is what many people misunderstand. Avoidant people are not necessarily cold or without feelings. In many cases, they experience strong emotions, but have difficulty staying present with those emotions when they become intense. Pulling away does not automatically mean they do not care. Sometimes it means caring has become frightening for them. So when they hurt you by withdrawing, becoming quiet, choosing isolation, or creating emotional distance, they can look as though nothing happened. Yet internally, there may be a complicated emotional process taking place, shaped by years of learning that closeness could be unsafe. This pattern often has roots in early experiences. Many people who develop strong avoidant tendencies grew up in environments where emotional expression was not encouraged. Their needs may have been ignored, minimized, criticized, or treated like an inconvenience. They may have learned that asking for comfort created problems, that depending on someone was risky, or that showing too much emotion could lead to rejection. So they adapted in the only way they knew. They learned to rely heavily on themselves, hide their emotional needs, and keep people far enough away that nobody could get close enough to hurt them deeply. That strategy can work for a long time. It can even make them appear extremely independent and emotionally strong. But everything changes when they genuinely fall in love with someone, because love brings them directly toward the exact experiences they have spent years trying to avoid. Intimacy asks them to stay emotionally present. Closeness asks them to trust. Connection asks them to reveal parts of themselves they normally keep protected. And suddenly, the defenses that once made them feel safe begin to feel threatened. They may start feeling trapped or overwhelmed, not necessarily because the other person is demanding too much, but because emotional closeness activates an old fear that they are not enough for someone to stay with. That fear can be difficult to explain because it may exist beneath conscious awareness. So the withdrawal after an argument, the sudden silence, the unexplained exit, or the decision to create distance is not always as simple as not caring. Sometimes it is shame hiding behind avoidance. It can be the shame of not knowing how to show up when the relationship needed them, the shame of hurting someone who genuinely cared, and perhaps most painfully, the shame of feeling as though they have once again confirmed the story they secretly believe about themselves, that they ruin good relationships whenever something becomes emotionally important. Instead of expressing any of this, they may bury it. Talking openly about shame would require them to become vulnerable, and vulnerability is exactly what their emotional system has trained them to escape. So the shame remains quiet. It stays underneath the surface, reinforcing the same negative story they have carried for years. And this creates a painful cycle, because the more ashamed they feel, the more they may withdraw, and the more they withdraw, the more evidence they believe they have that they are incapable of maintaining closeness. Here is the painful irony. Many avoidant people continue thinking about a relationship long after it has ended. They may remember the patience you showed. They may remember the effort you made. They may remember the times you tried to reach them when they had already started closing the door. And what they feel may not always be anger toward you. Sometimes it is disappointment in themselves. It can be quiet and almost invisible, but still persistent. They may bury themselves in work, routines, hobbies, social activity, or even another relationship, because staying busy gives them less time to sit with what happened. But unresolved shame does not necessarily disappear just because someone stops talking about it. It can return during quiet nights, certain dates, familiar places, songs, conversations, or unexpected reminders of how emotionally safe they once felt with someone. Suddenly, something they thought they had moved past can come back with surprising force. And there is a deeper contradiction here. Avoidant people can want love just as deeply as anyone else. They can crave connection, affection, security, and emotional closeness. But when they actually receive those things, the experience can expose the exact fear they have been protecting themselves from for years. The fear of needing another person, the fear of becoming emotionally dependent, the fear that someone will eventually have the power to hurt them. And when that fear causes them to push away someone they genuinely care about, the result can reinforce another painful belief they already carry, that they simply cannot hold on to love. That belief feeds the shame even more. And shame is not the same thing as guilt. Guilt says, I did something wrong. Shame says, there is something wrong with me. That difference is incredibly important. Guilt can motivate a person to apologize, repair the damage, and change the behavior. Shame often makes someone want to hide. It can make them disappear rather than return. It can convince them that facing the person they hurt will only expose how deeply flawed they feel. So you may wonder, if they really feel this much shame, why do they not come back and repair what they damaged? The answer can be difficult to accept. Repair requires emotional exposure. It requires saying things they may have spent their entire life avoiding, such as, I was scared. I didn't understand what I was feeling. I didn't know how to stay. I hurt you because I didn't know how to handle closeness. For someone whose entire coping system was built around hiding vulnerability, those words can feel terrifying. There is nowhere to hide once you admit the truth. So instead, they may reach for the coping strategy they know best. They convince themselves that ending the relationship was logical. They tell themselves the timing was wrong, the relationship was too complicated, the circumstances were impossible, or leaving was simply the sensible choice. But logic does not erase emotion. It can only cover it temporarily. Beneath the explanation, they may still know that they hurt someone who cared for them sincerely, and that knowledge can remain with them even if they never admit it to you or anyone else. You may never see that internal struggle directly. They may never discuss it publicly. They may never send the message you hoped would come. They may never sit across from you and explain what was really happening inside them. Yet what they experienced can still influence how they behave in future relationships. Some people respond by becoming even more avoidant. They become more independent, more emotionally guarded, and more determined never to need anyone again. Others, especially when the loss affects them deeply, begin questioning the patterns they have repeated for years. They may finally wonder why closeness always makes them panic, why they leave when things become meaningful, or why they repeatedly lose people they genuinely care about. But whatever path they take, there is something you need to remember for yourself. Their shame was never yours to carry. It was never your responsibility to repair their emotional wounds or prove that they were worthy of love. It can be tempting to believe that if you had been more patient, more understanding, more flexible, or less emotional, they might have stayed. But their avoidance did not begin with you. Their fear did not begin with you. Their shame did not begin with you. You were simply the person who became close enough for those patterns to become visible. You were not too emotional simply because you wanted communication. You were not asking for too much simply because you wanted consistency. You were asking for connection, and genuine relationships require connection. The fact that they struggled to provide that connection does not automatically mean your needs were unreasonable. It means they may have been dealing with an internal conflict that you could not solve for them. You could offer patience, but you could not teach them how to become emotionally available. You could offer understanding, but you could not remove their fear. You could offer love, but you could not make them feel safe enough to receive it. And sometimes the most powerful thing that happens to an avoidant person is losing someone who truly loved them. Not because loss is a punishment, and not because you should disappear to manipulate them into coming back, but because your absence can remove the distractions they used to avoid facing themselves. When you stop chasing them, stop explaining yourself repeatedly, stop trying to convince them to stay, and stop carrying the entire emotional weight of the relationship, they are left with their own patterns. In that silence, there may finally be room for the feelings they kept pushing away to surface. They may begin seeing what their behavior actually cost them. They may recognize that the person they lost was not the problem. They may finally understand that running from intimacy did not protect them from pain. It simply created another kind of pain. And that can become the beginning of real self-awareness, but only if they choose to face it honestly. Stay with this part, because this is where the story can change. Some avoidant people eventually choose to confront their patterns. They may seek professional help, learn to identify their emotions, practice communicating their needs, and slowly discover that vulnerability is not the weakness they once believed it was. They begin understanding that depending on someone does not automatically mean losing themselves. They learn that healthy closeness can exist without control, pressure, or emotional chaos. Little by little, they begin rewriting the story they have carried for years. They realize that protecting themselves from every possible hurt also protected them from experiencing genuine connection. But others continue running. They may tell themselves that they simply have not found the right person yet. They may blame timing, circumstances, compatibility, or the other person's needs, without recognizing the pattern repeating beneath all of it. They move from one connection to another, while carrying the same fear into each new relationship. And eventually, they may discover that changing the person beside them never changed what was happening inside them. The pattern followed them because the pattern was never about one specific person. It was about how they learned to survive closeness. So, if someone with avoidant attachment hurt you, remember this. You do not need to chase their shame to prove that you are worth loving. You do not need to repair the wound they created. You do not need to make yourself smaller so someone else can feel safer. Their journey is theirs. Your healing is yours. And sometimes the healthiest ending is not getting the explanation you wanted. Sometimes it is finally understanding that you deserved a relationship where love did not require you to constantly convince someone to stay. That realization may hurt at first, but it can also become the moment you stop carrying someone else's emotional burden and begin choosing peace for yourself. That is because the deeper problem was never really the person standing in front of them. The real struggle existed inside them long before that relationship ever started. It was the unresolved shame, fear, and emotional pain they had been carrying for years. So, if someone with an avoidant attachment style has hurt you, remember this truth. Their distance was never evidence that you were impossible to love or too difficult to be close to. In many situations, the connection may have felt real enough to activate fears they had spent years keeping under control. That tells you much more about their emotional defenses than it does about your value. None of this makes the hurt disappear. It does not make the heartbreak less real, and it certainly does not excuse the way they treated you. But it can change the meaning you attach to what happened. You were not necessarily too much. You may simply have brought them face to face with emotions they had never learned to understand, regulate, or express. And the shame they may carry now, hidden, quiet, and probably never spoken aloud, can be very real. It is not there as some punishment or as a way of making the universe even. It is simply one possible consequence of spending years avoiding emotional truth instead of learning how to face it. Eventually, someone who spends their life running away from intimacy has to encounter the parts of themselves they were running from, and inside that moment can live regret, unanswered questions, memories, and thoughts about the person who cared for them despite every wall they built. That is where their shame can remain. The important question is not whether they feel anything at all. Many people with avoidant patterns genuinely do. The more important question is whether they will turn those feelings into responsibility, self-awareness, and meaningful change. And that part has never been yours to control. No amount of empathy, patience, explanation, or love can make that decision for another person. It is worth staying with these ideas because they explain much more about what may be happening beneath the surface. Avoidant attachment is not simply a bad personality trait or proof that someone is a flawed human being. It is often a protective strategy developed by the nervous system early in life, especially when a child experiences caregivers who are emotionally unavailable, inconsistent, dismissive, or difficult to depend on. The child learns something very simple. Reaching out does not always bring comfort. Sometimes it brings rejection, disappointment, silence, or nothing at all. So eventually, the child stops reaching. That response is not weakness, it is adaptation. The problem is that the strategy that once helped the child cope can become the same strategy that isolates the adult years later, even when the original danger is no longer present. The adult may still react as though closeness is dangerous because their emotional system learned that lesson long before they had the ability to question it. Then there is the difference between guilt and shame, and although the distinction may sound small, it can completely change what happens after someone hurts another person. Guilt focuses on behavior. It says, "What I did was wrong." Because guilt is connected to an action, it can point toward repair. A person can apologize, change the behavior, make amends, and try again. Shame is different. Shame focuses on identity. It says, "Something about me is wrong." And when the problem feels connected to who you are, rather than something you did, repair becomes much harder to imagine. You can change an action. It is much harder to know how to repair a negative belief about your entire identity. That is why guilt can encourage someone to move closer and fix the damage, while shame can make someone hide, distract themselves, and disappear. The nervous system side of this matters too. When someone grows up learning that emotional openness leads to disappointment, criticism, rejection, or abandonment, their body can begin treating closeness like a threat. It may respond to emotional intimacy in a way that resembles the response to physical danger. So when deep connection appears later in adulthood, the reaction may not feel like a calm decision. It can feel automatic. It can feel like a reflex that happens before the person has enough time to understand what they are doing. This helps explain why avoidant withdrawal can appear so sudden or extreme from the outside. To you, it may look like they simply changed their mind overnight. Inside them, however, their nervous system may be reacting to emotional closeness using an old protective pattern that was developed years earlier. Understanding this does not mean accepting the hurtful behavior. It simply explains why logic, reassurance, and promises can sometimes fail to calm the reaction in the moment. Another important point is that the quiet self-disgust we have been discussing is not necessarily the same thing as depression or ordinary self-pity. It can be a much more specific form of self-judgment, connected to the belief that they are fundamentally incapable of maintaining emotional closeness. It rarely announces itself openly. Instead, it may appear through small behaviors, avoiding certain memories, staying constantly busy, working too much, starting new routines, keeping the mind occupied, becoming restless late at night, refusing to think about what happened. These behaviors can allow someone to carry painful feelings for years without ever giving those feelings a clear name. And naming them would mean admitting something vulnerable about themselves, which is exactly what they have spent so much time avoiding. Now consider what can happen when you finally stop chasing someone with avoidant patterns. Your absence is not simply an empty space, it can become information. As long as you are reaching out, explaining, reassuring, checking in, and trying to keep the relationship alive by yourself, the other person has something outside themselves to focus on. Your effort can unintentionally become a buffer between them and their own emotional discomfort. They can respond to your messages, they can think about your reactions, they can focus on whether you are still there. All of that can keep their attention directed outward. But when the chasing stops, that distraction disappears. When you stop trying to convince them, stop over-explaining your feelings, and stop carrying the entire relationship alone, they may suddenly have much less to focus on outside themselves. That is when a deeper reckoning can begin, not because you forced it, not because silence is a strategy designed to make them return, but because there is finally less noise between them and their own internal experience. They have to face what their behavior created and what the relationship meant to them. They have to sit with questions they may have avoided for a long time. Why did I leave? Why did closeness scare me? Why did I push away someone I cared about? Why does this loss still bother me? Those questions can be uncomfortable, but discomfort can sometimes become the beginning of self-awareness. Self-awareness matters because simply recognizing a pattern is not the same as changing it. Many people with avoidant tendencies already have some idea that they repeat the same cycle. They may notice that relationships become difficult when intimacy increases. They may recognize that they pull away when someone gets emotionally close. They may even realize that they keep losing people they genuinely care about. What they may lack is the willingness to remain with the discomfort long enough to do something different. Real growth requires more than insight. It requires practice. It requires learning to experience fear without immediately obeying it. This is why therapy, honest reflection, and emotionally safe relationships can help some people change. They can create a structured environment where vulnerability is practiced gradually rather than demanded all at once. Growth does not mean waking up one morning and suddenly becoming fearless. It means learning that fear can exist without automatically controlling your behavior. It means feeling the urge to run and learning that you can pause. It means wanting distance and still communicating honestly. It means becoming uncomfortable without immediately disappearing. That is how a new emotional pattern can slowly develop. And the idea of eventually running into yourself is really just another way of describing what happens when distractions stop working. For a while, a new relationship can keep old feelings buried. A new routine can keep the mind occupied. Work can provide constant stimulation. Social activity can prevent quiet reflection. Everything can appear fine as long as there is something happening. But unresolved emotions do not disappear simply because the person stays busy. Eventually, often during a completely ordinary moment, those feelings can return. There may be no dramatic breakdown, no major event, no cinematic confrontation. Sometimes it is just a quiet night, when there is finally nothing left to distract them. And suddenly, the memories return, the questions return, the regret returns. That is not necessarily punishment. It is simply what can happen when something unresolved has nowhere left to hide. Whether that moment leads to genuine change, or whether the person pushes the feelings down again, depends entirely on what they choose to do next. No partner can make that choice for them. No amount of love can force self-awareness. No amount of patience can create accountability inside someone who refuses to take responsibility. By now, you may have recognized pieces of your own experience throughout this discussion. Maybe you recognize someone you loved. Maybe you recognize behaviors within yourself. That is one of the strange things about attachment patterns. They rarely affect only one person. They spread through relationships and influence everyone who becomes emotionally close enough to experience them. And if you have stayed this far, you may not simply be interested in psychology. You may be trying to understand something that happened to you, something that left you with questions you could not answer at the time. So now it is important to bring all of this together in a way you can actually use, not as complicated theory, but as a healthier way to understand love, distance, emotional wounds, and your own worth. The first truth to remember is simple. Understanding why someone becomes avoidant does not mean excusing the harm they caused. These are two completely different things, and when you are the person left hurting, it is very easy to confuse them. You can understand that their withdrawal may have been connected to childhood experiences, fear, emotional conditioning, or a nervous system that learned to experience closeness as dangerous, and you can still hold them responsible for how they treated you. Both truths can exist at the same time. Their history can explain their behavior, while your pain remains real and valid. Compassion for what happened to them does not require you to erase what happened to you. This is especially important because people who love avoidant partners can easily fall into the habit of explaining the other person's behavior until their own feelings disappear. They tell themselves, they didn't mean it, they're just afraid, they have been hurt before. If I had been more patient, they might have stayed. Maybe some of those statements contain truth, but they can also become a hiding place, a place where you avoid feeling your anger, a place where you suppress your grief, a place where you convince yourself that wanting consistency was somehow unreasonable. Healing requires something more balanced. You can understand their fear without taking responsibility for it. You can recognize their wounds without becoming responsible for healing them. You can feel compassion without abandoning your own boundaries. Their limitations were not yours to repair, soften, or carry forever. You were allowed to want communication. You were allowed to want affection. You were allowed to want reliability. You were allowed to expect emotional respect. And if someone could not provide those things, that limitation belonged to them. It was never proof that your needs were excessive. It was never evidence that you were unlovable. It was simply information about what that person was capable of giving at that point in their life.